Hi, everyone. I'm incredibly excited to be back here at the end of the day. I started my day here giving the welcome session, and now I'm back here for our last session of the day with the wonderful and talented Alka Tandan. I'm going to let you introduce yourself fully, Alka, so please don't worry. There's no need to dive in just yet. The important stuff I need to mention first, I think a lot of people will have already been to other summit sessions today. But the important things to note are that the chat function is for chat, obviously. So you can do us a big favor right now and just let us know that you can hear us. And maybe just for fun, tell us where you are in the world. We've had all sorts of incredible distances covered today. We had someone from New Zealand earlier this morning, which I was very excited about. That's where I'm from originally, but all over the world. Including people who must have been up at crazy times of the night. So we feel really lucky and happy to have you all with us. Wonderful. I'm going to read just 3 or 4 of them because there's too many already, but I can see someone from Manila. That's Catherine. Hi, Catherine. How are you? We have Eduardo from Milan, Angeline in Nottingham. Who else do we have? Jacqueline in Vienna. So already you can tell we're all over the place. Alka, very quickly, where are you?
I'm in Palo Alto, California.
Fantastic. And I'm in Paris, France. So already we're doing pretty well in 2 continents. And as we saw from the visitors or the attendees at this session, many more continents covered. That was the chat function. But very importantly, there's also right next to it the Q&A function, which again, it does what it says. That's the place to ask your questions if you want us to answer them. If you put them in the chat, we just probably won't see them because, you know, there's a lot going on. And we really want to keep the chat free for chat and for quick reactions. If you want to put a +1 at something someone says or yes, please do that in the chat. Questions in the Q&A. And that's really the most important thing for this session. But I wanted also to remind you just before we jump in that we have lots of wonderful partners who you can meet in the tools and tech section. And we're calling it the tools and tech section because that's what it is. If you want to get a look inside some of these great finance tools or meet some of the people behind the services and consultancies, that's the place to go. So please don't be shy. Go there, ask them hard questions, make them work. That's why they're there. Okay. I'll remind you about that at the end of the session as well. So yeah, you can look forward to that. But now it's time to begin our fireside chat because the whole purpose of this is really to get to know Alka Tandan. And so to begin, I'm going to let you kind of tell us your story, Alka Tandan. What brings you here today?
Yeah, so, you know, I always love to tell, you know, sort of the personal story of sort of why I'm here today, in addition to sort of the resume, which, you know, of course, anybody can sort of read online about. The story really starts with, you know, my parents who were, you know, 2 immigrants and they came from India back in the 70s. My father got both his master's and his PhD in engineering. And they came here sort of for the dream, heard about a place called Silicon Valley and settled here. They still often talk about my father interviewing my mother sitting, you know, in the car because they really sort of came with nothing. So I really grew up in Silicon Valley. You know, I always joke that I'm one of the unicorns because there's not many of us who actually grew up here and stayed here. But I really grew up with it. And at a very young age, just sort of understood the power of it. I still remember my father coming with his, telling me he had a surprise for me and it was a semiconductor wafer. And of course, you know, only I would be excited about something like that. But, you know, it coincided with the time that we just got computers in our school. And he explained to me that these were powering the computers, and computers back then were like magic. And I sort of consider that's where I really started loving, you know, this industry because I saw the power of it. And over time, I had other family members come and most of them are in the tech industry. And so that's really where my love of the industry started. And so over 20 years later, I'm still here and still excited about it and still amazed at what it's done in the world.
Fantastic. And by today, we mean you are the Senior Vice President of Finance and Strategic Programs at Gainsight. Perhaps you could take us through, I don't know, you could maybe the full journey, or perhaps just the most recent. What brings you to that role specifically?
Yeah. So I knew, I love my father, but I knew I wasn't going to be an engineer. And so I knew that I really enjoyed the business side of things. And my mother was a businesswoman as well. So I had sort of watched her. So I actually started my career in investment banking, and which was a great way to just learn a lot. Went to business school and decided to be in operations. Started actually in media and worked in a variety of different roles. And then decided that I really wanted to go into SaaS and saw the power of it as a business, and landed about Gainsight about 2.5 years ago, and helped scale the company. And we last year announced a majority investment by Vista, which we were all very excited about. So it's been quite a journey. And Gainsight is very special because it actually started a customer success industry. And so to be part of a journey of a company that has scaled the way it has, but also created an industry, has been a very incredible journey.
And I mean, there's more to mergers and acquisitions and big business moves than the money number, but it was a pretty juicy number, 1.1 billion, which makes you a double unicorn, I guess, because you were already a unicorn, as you mentioned. How does that feel?
Yes, it feels great. It certainly feels great. You know, it was I'll say a personal goal of mine. There is something very special about that number. But what made it incredibly special was that, you know, you sort of essentially at that sort of a number, which was, you know, basically a majority investment by Vista, who is our current investment partner. It was a real validation of not just the business, but also the industry. And so our founders and our CEO, who's been with the company pretty much since inception, really created this industry. So it was incredible validation, especially for it to be done by someone like Vista, that this industry is here to stay, that it's incredibly valuable. We knew it was, but to have someone come in as sort of a third party and give sort of their stamp, gave us incredible validation.
Specifically, what do we mean by creating the industry? Because obviously we're talking customer success, and customer service has been around for as long as there have been customers. So what do we mean by creating the customer success industry?
Yeah, so basically our software helps you track current customers and the health of customers as soon as it becomes a customer and through the lifetime that it becomes a customer. And so, yes, there was support, but we basically taken the concept and basically said, okay, the entire company should be sort of aligned around the customer and be customer centric. And so that's what I mean by sort of creating the concept where it's not just a support function now, but it's sort of the central place for everyone in the company to gather around and really sort of focus on. And with that, you know, we've also created sort of benchmarks and created sort of a system around that. And it works. You know, what we found is we've actually, there's actually a study, you can actually go on our website where the Software Equity Group, where they looked at 90 public companies and saw that valuations increase when you sort of focus on retaining your current customers, as well as selling more to them. And so, you know, we know it works, but it took a little while for everyone to sort of catch up.
I think you're right. That is something that people are really figuring out, or companies are really figuring out today, that customer obsession is the other kind of catchphrase, or the phrase that gets thrown around a lot. Because people are figuring out that, exactly as you said, financially, it makes so much more sense to keep customers for longer and to keep them happy than to always be thinking about the next customer.
Yes, financially, because it takes a lot more money to get a new customer. So you want to always keep doing that. But if you're able to keep your customers and help grow them and grow the revenue, you need to have basically both. But it is cheaper to do that. So yes, and the markets agree.
To go back to the investment for a moment, because I think people still want to know more about that. Have things changed much since? I guess sorry, I forgot the date, but it was towards the end of 2020.
It was December 2020, yes.
December 2020. Okay, so 9 months, 10 months. Have things changed? Is it still the same company?
I'd like to think it's better, actually. I think it's been an incredible partnership for us. I can tell you when it announced, I got texts from ex-colleagues, business school friends, all saying, congratulations on Vista in particular. And so for those that don't know, Vista has about $80 billion in assets. If you add them all up, they're probably the fourth or fifth largest software company, in the world, depending upon the day. And so but it's been a partnership. I would say it's been a true partnership. And what I mean by that is they have brought a lot of their ideas and operational rigor that they've learned across, their portfolio, because they are very successful at what they do and investing in companies. And, we've been able to bring things to the table as well, particularly around educating everybody on customer success and the best way to do it, which of course helps them across their portfolio. But, in the day-to-day, it really, truly hasn't changed. We are still focused on all the same things. We're still focused on growing new customers, as well as retaining and doing the best with our current customers. So, on the day-to-day, we're still really just focused on the fundamentals of the business. Now we just have partners where we can bounce things off of. And so that makes it incredibly valuable.
Do you think any of that dynamic is due to the fact that Vista is an investment firm and has made an investment, whereas obviously a lot of merger and acquisitions are companies being absorbed into larger companies and having to actually fit product-wise?
Yes, I think it's two really different scenarios. Vista is really as we are really focused on creating value for the company, and so that's a very different lens than all of a sudden you're one of now maybe many products in what I'll call a strategic acquisition. So everyone is still very focused on creating value, and then therefore it definitely takes a different lens.
Okay, and then thinking back maybe even a bit before the investment, can you identify any sort of specific keys to growing and scaling Gainsight so successfully?
So when you are a leader in the industry, it's definitely, there's a cost to that. We do conferences like this, and which is great. We do a Pulse conference. We have, I think we had over 10,000 people attend just sort of last year. So there's a certain cost to it, but because when you're a leader and you're creating the benchmarks and you've created the industry, people come to you, and you always usually have a seat at the table. So that's definitely a strategy once you're sort of just when you're basically the leader and you're creating it. Other than that, I really think it's just honestly fundamentals. So when you're early in a company, you're looking at total addressable market, you're looking at product market fit. And then as you start scaling, you look at, your go-to-market strategy. And so we're looking at different verticals, as well as different geos, and creating a strategy around that. And then also every SaaS company at some point really needs to look at being multi-product. We did that actually initially through an acquisition, our PX, which is our product experience product. But there are, of course, many ways to do it. And so that definitely, I think those are, at the end of the day, it's sort of back to fundamentals, whether you're a leader or not.
How did you personally find the investment process? It can only have been stressful, I'm sure.
It was stressful and it was exciting at the same time. Usually I've done a lot of M&A. I started my career in M&A, and I would say nearly every operational role, I've done it, but this one was certainly, special because I was part of scaling it and, part of, the exec team at that time. So what normally happens in a process like that is everyone just drops what they're doing and really just focuses on the acquisitions, especially at the senior levels. And then we just figure out who needs to be in the tent, so to speak. And so typically finance and accounting is the heart of it, and we're running the due diligence process. And this was the way this one happened too. It actually ends up being, I would say, an incredible bonding experience for the team as well. We're all working for the same goal. So yes, you're not sleeping a lot because you're working a lot, but you're also because you're just excited. And so, yes, stressful, but a lot of excitement with it too.
And as a leader at the company, does it bring you closer as well to the other leadership? Are you have to, I imagine, become much more aligned on the company message, the growth trajectory, why you're interested in investment, etc.?
Yes, you get to know each other very quickly. It's relationship by fire for sure. So and yeah, so it sort of goes both ways. They're getting to know us, we're getting to sort of know them as well. So it is. I would say it's sort of a very quick bonding experience, but one that's sort of gratifying, and then you continue to sort of get to know each other afterwards.
Okay, we're going to move away from the investment process, but if anybody has any questions, please do throw them in the Q&A tab, as I said, and we'll have lots of time for Q&A at the end. But I want to talk more about finance strategy, because you spoke to CFO Connect last year, I believe, and at the time you were very focused on bottom-up financial analysis. That was the expression that you used. What does that mean? Could you tell us what bottom-up financial analysis is and why it's so valuable?
Yeah, so bottoms up, and I'll introduce another term, which is called zero-based budgeting. I would say they're very similar, which is you're really looking at every single line item as you are. Bottoms up means you're looking at every single line item as you're doing your budget. Zero-based budgeting is even if you have a prior budget, you still start every year, you start from scratch. Why it's important, and either way, so zero-based budgeting is basically a subset of bottoms up. Why it's important is because I really think it really helps you look at the business with fresh eyes every year. And especially when you're in an industry like technology where things are just constantly changing, it's really helpful to really ask the questions, is this still needed? Why is it useful? Are there better vendors or better tools out there, for example, if we're looking at, a software cost? So I think asking sort of those questions, yes, it takes a little bit longer. It's much easier to just take last year's budget and say, what more do you need as we're growing? But I think it really brings in a certain amount of strategy to ask the interesting questions where everybody can really think through. And what ends up happening is I think you just get a budget that is much more solid based on fundamentals, but also just much more efficient. You're really using your capital very efficiently. So yes, we continue to do it, and we do it. We're actually starting our planning cycle right now, and it ends up being an interesting process and a good dialogue.
Just to be very clear on that, the idea is that you are using the real financial data that you have to make the next set of decisions, rather than, I suppose, relying more on the projections that you made 12 months ago for the next 3 years and seeing where you are in that projection.
We're always looking at real-time data because again, in a tech industry, we saw it during COVID, right? That was a very extreme version. Things changed very rapidly, and then we've seen, this year, SaaS companies have done actually quite well. So we're seeing it in a different way, where we're actually having to invest more as we continue to exhibit, incredible growth. So always look at the most recent data.
Right. And so then obviously, I guess that suggests that you need to have real-time access to all that data. And is that the biggest hurdle, the biggest challenge if you want to be bottoms up in terms of your financial analysis?
It could be depending upon your systems. For us, I wouldn't say that is the biggest challenge. I think, for us, it takes some time and it takes a lot of sort of dialogue. And sometimes we have to ask, I think, some difficult questions, and sometimes it can even be controversial. And I think, but it's in those dialogues that I think where actually great decisions, I think, can be made. I think the mindset's always easier to sort of stay with what you're doing. And I find actually that the most interesting and at times kind of challenging process.
Do you have a large FP&A team as a result of this, or as a way to achieve this?
I would say we're probably good size at the moment. It is global though. So, we have a huge presence in India. So we do have some, and we are growing that presence, in India in terms of FP&A. But I would say, I've had some great leaders at FP&A as well as some junior people as well. But I wouldn't say it's extraordinarily large. Of course, as we get bigger, we're going to have to continue to do our analysis. And what I love about our FP&A team is not only are they just great at budgeting, but they really do help develop just analytical models around the business. So they are true business partners. And I think that's really what great FP&A teams do. They're not just doing the budgeting, but they're really building the analytics around key decision making, and as well as just the operations around the business. So they do both.
I'm sure everybody would love to know what the finance team structure is in general. Who's in the team? What kind of units you have? And were you a part of building the team as well?
Yes.
I mean, I know it's to some extent. Yeah. Okay. So maybe you could take us through putting it together.
So I find finance teams are formed two ways, and I've actually had both types of teams. Either they sort of follow a P&L closely, meaning that someone really owns the revenue lines and the top lines, and then other people own expense lines. And then I've also seen it where people will actually own lines of businesses. So that really works well if you have GMs for like different product lines, and then they become sort of like mini CFOs. Currently the way we're structured is we have someone who basically runs corporate, runs the total P&L. And then I've got a couple other people basically owning different expense departments because that's the way our org is structured. I wouldn't be surprised as we continue to get bigger and we essentially have sort of GMs of businesses, because that usually happens when you're much bigger, that there will come a point where I'll just need to have each of them be sort of own a line of business and own the full P&L. So that's how we're currently structured. I think both work. There's pros and cons to each.
Nice. Okay. Again, in that previous conversation you had with us last year, you mentioned defining, or the importance of defining, your vital metrics was the expression you used. What are your vital metrics? Could you talk us through that, please?
Yes. There's a lot of numbers you can run, so it's just important to know which ones to focus on. We also have the term North Star metric, which is the most important one as well. So for us, it's still all around top line growth, and even if you look at public company comparables, they are valued on top line growth. So that means looking at revenue and looking at revenue growth. For private companies, that means ARR growth. That's something that's not usually published, but understanding sort of your waterfall. And what goes into both of those is GRR, gross renewal rate, which is, of course, very near and dear to Gainsight, because that's what our product helps with, as well as NRR, so net retention, which includes upsell as well. So what more you're selling to sort of current customers and new bookings. So we're really focused on those on a regular basis. We do look at profitability as well. There's a very popular metric called Rule of 40, which basically takes top line growth and profitability. And if both of those equal 40%, it means you're running a very efficient company. So we do track that as well. And then, of course, each department has their own metrics. So, for example, customer success, we look at both leading and lagging indicators and metrics. So lagging indicators for customer success are the ones I just mentioned, GRR and NDR. But leading indicators would be things like adoption percentage and NPS, as well as verifiable outcomes. So we have, and you can find those. We've got a great blog on our website that kind of details like what each of these metrics mean. So I would encourage everybody to just take a look. So we look at both. So we definitely look at our vital metrics as a company that I'm focused on, but we do dive deep into department-specific metrics too.
Fantastic. Just while we're here talking nuts and bolts, numbers and things, we had a question from Laurent about the zero-based budget approach. And the question is, how do you actually get started? Do you start from scratch, even including the people and personnel costs?
I would say even people and personnel, and obviously we have to be very, sensitive and respectful. So I think it's something that's, we're be very careful, with who's in that room for sure. But yes, I think you absolutely include those. And again, the goal is just to, oftentimes, sometimes we need to just shift, people. Like I think one thing Gainsight does really well is actually allows the opportunity for people to try new things. It's something that employees say they really love actually about our company. So it doesn't have to be, I would say, a controversial conversation, and just because you're looking at it and discussing it doesn't mean you're going to do much. I think action comes later. So absolutely, I would certainly start, you can certainly discuss personnel. And then I think it's literally just going through each one of the items and just having sort of a discussion. You can certainly use last year as a discussion point too, if that seems to be easier. But I think, we can talk about T&E, for example. Next year, I think it starts the discussion of, okay, will people start traveling? What's our stance on it? And what do we actually want? Do we want employees now in this new world to travel as much as they did 2 years ago? So you start really, as you're talking about each of these, you really start thinking about what's your stance and your strategy on each of these items. And it kind of just forces you to think a little bit more critically.
Right. And just finally, before we move on to some other topics, what are the kinds of challenges you're thinking about at the moment? What are you focused on, as the leader of the finance team?
So I think right now, I think we're really, as we kind of think through the next couple of years of sort of where we want to go, we're really just focused on it's a lot of fine tuning at this point. We have the basics, but it's, our systems, well, do we have the right systems? Do we need to sort of upgrade our systems? I think that's a big one. I think the same thing on processes. Let's fine tune this. And so I would say it's really, and then staffing, we talked a little bit about staffing, like, do we have the right org in place as we sort of continue to grow, particularly in this environment where recruiting is, I would say, very competitive. So, so just thinking a little bit ahead of those types of things and like where we want to be in, not just like in the next year, but really like in 2 years, because things move very fast. So those are kind of the things that we're really focused on.
Is it fair to say that a lot of those challenges are actually pretty evergreen? I mean, obviously the scale of them will be different now, and the scale of them will be different. But you may have had similar challenges 2 years ago. We're just talking at a different level today.
I think that's exactly right. I think that's exactly right. I think the one thing is, I think G&A as a group tends to be invested a little bit less when you're sort of early in the company. You're really focused on product, and then you're focused on go to market. So I think in that way, I think, as you start scaling, you really have to focus on the G&A team, and like, okay, it's time to sort of really focus on investing here.
All right, I'd like to talk a little bit more about your career, if we could. And I'm particularly interested in, you kind of had a pivot point where you moved into SaaS and tech. Could you tell us about that sort of moment and I don't know, what brought you to SaaS and why you've stayed?
Yeah. So after business school, I spent most of my time in a company called IGN, which I enjoyed very much. It was a place where I just got to do a lot. I started the function there. We did 6 M&A transactions in like 4.5 years. We eventually sold ourselves. So I took a little bit of break after that. I actually went to Europe. I went to Europe and spent like about 6 weeks there and really thought about what I wanted to do next. And I think it was about 2013. And Andreessen had just 2 years before had their big manifesto. Andreessen is a premier venture capital firm here in the Valley. Talked about software aiding the world, and so a lot of people were talking about that. And so I had done an internship at SAP, back when I was in business school, but I immediately saw the power of SaaS. And so really kind of just sort of studied it, looked at it, understood that it was just a great opportunity, and just started looking at different companies, and decided that this was sort of like where I probably wanted to spend the rest of my career in. And so, but it's about the business. It's a very sort of, I'll say sort of efficient business. It has and basically has an addressable market that's, I wouldn't say unlimited, but it's pretty much everywhere. So we have software in our homes, we have software in our cars, et cetera. And once it sort of moved to the cloud, it became, I would say, just an incredible business. So that was the moment.
And is there one piece of advice that you might give someone else, I guess, in the a finance professional who's trying to find their sort of niche or their spark? What would you tell them?
So I think it's two things. I think, first of all, I always tell people when they ask like career advice, I think you have to know what you enjoy, first of all, and then what you're also sort of good at. So I think it's sort of two things. And once you have those two pieces, I think it's talking to a lot of people, doing a lot of research and reading. And then once you start doing that, I do think it kind of ends up sort of coming to you. And that's what I did. You know, I went and I talked to prior bosses. I talked to a lot of people that were in the industry, and then a picture usually emerges. It's a little bit more of an art sort of versus a science. And particularly in finance, you know, of course, we're going to be looking at numbers, but it's also important to understand, I'll say, sort of, you know, those are sort of the hard facts, but also sort of the sort of softer facts also of, are these people I want to work with every single day? And is this something that's really going to help me be really passionate? I knew that software was going to sort of change the world and be everywhere. And so that for me was sort of the passion part of it.
Excellent. I just want to repeat to everybody, we're coming up to Q&A now. So it's the perfect time to put your questions in the Q&A tab. We do have one, which is fantastic. And because we're talking advice right now, that's what this question's all about. So it's, I guess, a little more specific than my pretty vague question I just asked you. But what are your key pieces of advice for early stage SaaS CFOs? And that's from Ian.
Yeah, I think the biggest piece of advice is choose your investors wisely. I think those early investors can really, help you and really help shape your business and who you have on your board. And that's literally probably the I think best piece of advice I can give you. Luckily for all of you who are at young companies, there's a lot of money out there, especially in this market. So I think that you can be really picky as you are sort of courting investors, or they're courting you rather. But I think getting the right people in to really help you is probably the biggest piece of advice I can give you.
Right. That's really thinking of investors as much as mentors as people with the purse strings, I guess.
Yes, it's both. You know, you'll always have, I think, your sort of personal mentors, but to have a board with really savvy investors that can also open doors for you, but have done this, ideally, many, many times, as well as sort of independent advisors who have maybe built companies, I think can really help you sort of in the journey.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. I would like to talk a little bit about leadership, because I know it's something that you are very passionate about. So first off, just a big, broad question. How do you define your leadership style?
I'll tell you what I aim for. What I aim for is to really lead with wisdom. And so, what that means is to lead with compassion, to lead with empathy, and even when there are mistakes and I make them, to really self-reflect and be self-aware of like how that happened and then remedy it, as much as possible. I think my team would say I'm very direct. I'm pretty sure they would say that. But I think we can all be, and they're frankly direct with me as well, which I like. So I think that constant loop, when it's done in a safe space, can be really helps with trust and enables trust as well. And I am their biggest supporters. I mean, I'm very fortunate to have an incredible team across the board. And so, they should, and hopefully know, and I ask on a very regular basis of like, what they need, not just, work wise, but also just long range professionally wise. I always say that they should be taking me out of a job. And I'm happy for them to do that, down the road. And of course, especially as we saw in COVID times, oftentimes work and personal sort of, mix. And so I'd like to think that they know I'm sort of there if they need help in that respect as well.
I really like you mentioned you used the word direct, which I think is something that's so underrated a lot of the time, because we put a lot of emphasis, rightly, on empathy and on caring, and we don't necessarily recognize the fact that you can really be empathetic and care for someone by telling them exactly what they can do to improve, or how they can help you, or how you can help them, but actually just by stating things rather than sugarcoating everything and working around the edges. I really like that as a leadership trait.
Yeah, and I think we can also think of it as being actually incredibly empathetic in the way that it does sort of help them. It helps all of us sort of get better. I think it's just often how it's delivered. It has to be delivered, of course, in a respectful way, in a kind way. And then we brush it off. We brush it off, and we keep going and doing the best that we can. And it's much better to talk through it, and then it just kind of lingering on. It doesn't really help team dynamics. So it's better for everybody that we just sort of talk through it, figure out what's the best course of action, and sort of keep getting better. And that makes us all feel a lot better.
Could you tell us about the human first leadership movement, please?
Yes, it's one of my favorite things to talk about. I definitely can't take credit. That was a term coined by our CEO, Nick Mehta. And that was, we'd like to think it's definitely a movement. So it's something that, his idea was that if we treat everybody in a human first way with humanity, essentially a lot of the qualities I sort of talked about, that it will help us win in business. And so that's essentially our business, our mission statement, to win in business by being human first. And so practically and tactically, what that means is, as we work with our customers, we maintain our humanity, and then they trust us more. Then then they'll tell us more, and then we can help their business more. We help their business, they do better, then they're advocates for us. It works internally as well, with our employees. If we address everything with humanity as well, they feel better. There's a lot more trust. We can have those direct conversations. We work better as a team. Everyone feels great because we're doing really well as a team. And so it becomes this sort of self-perpetuating mechanism. And in fact, when we did do the majority investment, what I really respected was, Nick said, well, this deal matters because it shows we can win in business first by being human first. And I just love that he said that, so yes, it's definitely central to everything we do.
And the last question before we move to Q&A, I mean, I'm sure we've basically discussed this a lot, but what is the place for finance leadership as a member of the senior leadership of a company? Like, what does a company need from its finance leaders compared with maybe what it will get from the CEO, the chief revenue officer, the chief product officer, etc.?
Yeah. So I think the main thing is the finance person is usually one of the few people that is looking at the business cross-functionally. And I think that's its best asset. I mean, you see that I also run strategic programs, and one of the reasons is because I actually sit across the entire business. So I think the most important thing that with having that knowledge is to just bring a perspective when we're making decisions of not just what's going on, for example, in customer success or sales, but how those decisions will affect the entire business, and sort of bring that perspective. And so then you're a thought. So essentially you're a thought leader, for the CEO, but really for everybody. And you sort of help connect the dots and just make sure nothing is forgotten when you're making one decision somewhere. So I think that is the most important role, not just for me, but I ask that my team also sort of play that role when they're going in and helping people make business decisions. So I think and that's what makes us very powerful, in addition to running the numbers, which is also very important, but it's being that thought partner.
I think as someone who didn't study finance, doesn't have a financial background, hearing from the finance leaders of companies is always so you just learn at such a fast rate, because I don't have this, foundation that I might have in a lot of other things. And I think that's true for actually probably the majority of employees in companies. They won't have come from finance backgrounds, and even things that seem simple and kind of obvious, when just explained, like, here's why we're making these financial decisions, it's actually quite empowering to understand the strategy behind the business. And it's, I think, probably quite easy it's quite an easy thing for a finance team to give to the other teams in the company.
And I love that, because depending upon the person, frankly, numbers can be a little bit intimidating. And so I think part of our job is with, leading with wisdom and being human first, is to make things, I think, simple and easily digestible, and understand the story sort of behind it.
We have a really nice question, another broad one, so we can go anywhere we want with this, from Malgozata. I hope I said your name in an acceptable manner. And it's really just, what is the future of FP&A?
Yeah, it's a beautiful name. It's interesting. I would say in the last year, I would say probably about 2 years, even before COVID, I've been asked to advise several FP&A companies, startups. And then during COVID, we also saw finance take a really central role, because everybody all of a sudden had to really pivot in terms of, sort of finance. So what both of those two data points, I think, means to me is, and even, as with the markets going, so well, I think the finance FP&A and the finance org is just going to continue to be super central. I see it in my own career by, also running strategic programs, that came started to me. So I would expect FP&A to continue to become actually even more strategic and more central to the organization, and as sort of we continue. Fantastic.
We have another really nice question that we may have to work through a little bit, from Rashmita. Having recently, I'm going to put the question on the stage, but we might need to figure out exactly what we're answering here. So the question is, having recently raised our Series A, we have a 2-day offsite strategy session. And I think the question is, as the finance director, what is your role in that 2-day offsite strategy session? And how can you be of most value to, I suppose, the other leaders of the business?
Good question. Well, hopefully there is, first of all, a framework that, you're going to be using during your strategy session. But I think the most important thing is, first of all, knowing the most important business metrics, the vital metrics for each of the groups, as well as just the general numbers. If you bring those to the table as you're working through different strategies, I think it's helpful to, just have sort of that background, because it just, as we're talking through ideas, you can actually really start solidifying them with numbers. I always think that, it's, you just need both. It's great to have sort of, vision and ideas, but let's also just put the numbers behind it and look at the full story, and then decide how we're sort of going to move forward. So I think if you come with the metrics and understanding the metrics as well as sort of, things like the budget, you will bring a really unique vantage point to the company, as well as what we talked about before, just understanding the full picture. So as you're talking about go-to-market strategy, you can also make sure that, make sure that product chimes in into that as well. So I think those are the two big things.
Wonderful. Okay, we have one more question, and I suspect it's going to be very difficult, but we will try to, I think, well, Alka, you can tell me whether you find this question very difficult or not. It's a question from Robert. When we're thinking about raising funds in a poor place, in this example, like Malawi, but any country that maybe is not Palo Alto, where the cost of capital is high, what do we think international businesses can do to lure investment? I think that's really the crux of the question. Let's not worry too much about the specifics, but what can you do to attract international investment?
It's It's a great question. I think if you're able to, I would say if you're actually able to go to a nearby place where there is a lot of capital. So for example, maybe it's London, maybe it's, Dubai, and talk to investors there. I think actually going to them, I think would be a great idea if you're able to. And actually nowadays you can probably do it, via Zoom. And I think what eventually is someone who's probably, Robert, you're probably a renegade, in this, you're probably just gonna have to educate them. You may end up being the person who educates investors on Malawi and, the benefits of it. And that actually could be a really incredible and satisfying role, but just be prepared to educate a lot of people. And then you will have to be the person and demonstrate that, you can help them work through a system. And then the last thing I'll say is, find a great, as you're educating people, like find probably the area of the world that is probably the most similar to what was Malawi. Maybe it was India. India was a very different place, many years ago. Maybe it's a different place, and help tell the story of how Malawi is going to be very similar to India, for example. And I think if you can create that vision and that story, as well as become sort of a trusted partner in sort of navigating a new country, I think that could be really attractive to investors. Because remember, there is a lot of capital out there and people are looking for new opportunities in new areas. They just don't know them. So if you can bring that to the table, I think that would be very valuable.
Okay, and final question, it's from Jamie. I like the way you phrased the question, Jamie, because it reads like a blog post header. What are 3 critical things? Let's just say, what are some critical things that FP&A teams need to have to be a key pillar for a company?
Well, I always say, it's broad, but I always say the numbers have to be right, because that's where you get trust. You have to deliver what you say you're going to deliver. And then you have to bring additional value on top of it. So it's very similar to what, we've been talking about in terms of being sort of a strategic advisor to the business. But also it's about fostering trust and that people really, that you're able to actually do what you say you're going to do. And then bring in something a little bit extra that perhaps they haven't really thought about. So I think it's very similar to, even what we do with our customers. And if you can do that internally, you will find over time, and do it in a human first way, you will find over time people are asking you and bringing you to the table because they really valued your advice.
Fantastic, thank you. And I'm thinking your name is probably Jaime. Apologies for the original pronunciation. Super last question from me. What is one thing that you are reading, watching, listening to, enjoying that you think everybody else needs to know about?
Oh, one thing that we are reading, and actually we're doing it as a company, and it's about Amazon's sort of flywheel. And it is a little bit of, we are actually looking at it in terms of our own planning process and figuring out what's our flywheel. And it's not even a huge, the one we looked at, I think there's a book, and then there's sort of the 40-page sort of primer on it. And I would encourage all of you. And it talks a little bit about what I was talking about with Human First, is how to create this self-perpetuating sort of mechanism. But I found it useful even in my own personal life. I created one for my personal, I created one for my employees as well. I think it's something that everybody should read, whether you're a young company or a more mature company, and sort of it will help guide your strategy.
Excellent. Alka Tandan, I want to thank you so much for the past 49 minutes. They've been incredibly insightful and informative. I'm sure everybody would agree.
I appreciate it. I really enjoyed it as well. And I'm wishing everyone a lot of luck.
Fantastic. Just a final reminder from me. This was the last session for the day. So we're back here at 11 a.m. our time, Central European time, which will, of course, be different wherever you are tomorrow. But straight after this, the summit doesn't just close. You can still virtually wander around and visit the tools and tech, as I said, do some networking. There's also a really cool matchmaking feature. So if you just want to meet someone and have a conversation for 2 minutes and then say goodbye, you can do that and get to know some people. So we just really encourage you to make the most of the kind of opportunities that we have available for the rest of the evening, tomorrow, and then Thursday. And otherwise, we'll see you all tomorrow. Thank you so much. Good evening.